Hi guys, welcome to Beesome Pretty. Honey here. Today is the second episode on the Witchcraft books, and today we are focusing on audiobooks. So how do I feel that the whole concept of audiobook works with books about witchcraft? Overall, I think that the majority of witchcraft books have sections that are more practical. You might have exercises, or especially if you have a grimoire section like half of the book, then the format of audiobook kind of doesn't work. I kind of find it a sad thing that, because I personally love to use a lot of audiobooks, because I don't always have the time to sit down and read, but then on the other hand, I have a lot of time while I'm driving at work or when I'm walking my dog, and those are the times when I love to multitask and listen something useful at the same time. So that's why I have been trying out several audiobooks also around the topic of witchcraft. But in any case, even though I don't think that the audiobooks are the preferred media for me for witchcraft books, I thought I would also do a mini review on the books that I have as audiobooks. So let's start with the first book, which is Matt Oren's Psychic Witch. This book kind of worked as an audiobook, but on the second hand, I don't think that as an audiobook you can get the most out of it, because this book is so jam-packed with exercises. There were several exercises that you could kind of do. Like you would listen to it, the instructions, and then just press pause and do those. Because overall the Psychic Witch book is happening in your head. And that's kind of why I like the book. I think it's a really good book overall and on a very important topic. It's a slightly different book than many of the other witchcraft books. And I think that there are some basic principles in it that are really useful for anybody who is at least starting to learn about witchcraft or is doing, because it teaches you a lot of basic mental, important concepts with the exercises and the importances. Because I think that the mental part of witchcraft is such a stepping stone, such a basic thing where you can start building on when your practice evolves. So I think that taking a lot of time with those skills is highly important. What surprised me in this book was that there were several exercises that I had been doing already earlier in my life, before I even had been thinking about witchcraft. So I was surprised several times when some of these exercises came up, and I was like, yeah, but I've been doing that for ages. Those were things that I just didn't know that are things. So that was interesting. And while we're talking about how important the concept behind Psychic Witch book is, I have to highlight one book, my only exception in this series, about a book that isn't about witchcraft. And it is Becoming Supernatural by Dr. Joe Dispenza. And my book is in Finnish. It's a sturdy book. But why I'm bringing up a book that is written by I don't know what one would title Joe Dispenza, some sort of modern meditation mindfulness guru, something, not sure. But way before I even started with tarot or anything else, I started to learn about meditation, and I got I read a lot of Joe Dispenza's materials, watched several of his videos, used several of his guided meditations and learned these techniques. And because it was the only thing I was doing at that time, it was my full practice. I kind of got a really great core knowledge and skills on the area of mindfulness and mind control and body control and those things that are also important parts of the Psychic Witch book. So I think it's not that important on what book or what techniques anybody would be learning and studying, but what I would highly recommend is that one would give these type of psychic or mental workouts or trainings a lot of time in the beginning of their path, because I think that it will be, when it comes naturally out of you, I think it will enhance all of the witchcraft practices in the future. So Matt Oren's Psychic Witch, I think, book definitely worth reading, but I think I would prefer to buy it on an actual book, or maybe in a Kindle version even. That could also work. But let's jump to the next book. Let's jump from the modern world to really ancient world, to the ancient world of Aradia, or The Gospel of the Witches by Charles Leland. And here we have a book that is written like centuries ago, because it came out in 1899, and so it truly is an old book. But I first got Aradia as an audiobook because it is a rather short book, and if you haven't heard of Aradia, which I think most of us have if we are interested on the topic around witchcraft, so he was a folklorist who wrote this book based on an Italian woman's materials or stories. So these ancient Italian witches, and it's talking about the goddess Diana and her daughter Aradia, and how she was the first witch who came on earth. But I really liked the audiobook, because what I think is really important in audiobooks that I missed on the intro part is that it's not only the structure of the book that is important, but also one highly important thing is who is reading it. What is the reader's voice? How are their pronunciation? How are their timing? Those things. So whenever you're getting an audiobook, please try the samples first, because some books are just impossible to listen if the voice is irritating, or the way of their how they speak is irritating. So the version that I have on Aradia's audiobook, I think it's fun, even though it has kind of music there and it's read in a really creepy way. There's a woman and a man, but I think it highly works. It's like listening on a story, and the way I use the audiobook on Aradia is that I listen to it when I go to bed before I fall asleep, like a bedtime story. So I think it works perfectly like that. But actually, I think Aradia is such a cornerstone piece of literature that I, of course, wanted to buy the actual physical book. It's not a big book, but I think it's definitely worth having also as a physical copy. Then in the last episode, I had those two collective books about topics around witchcraft and occult, and I also have one audio book that is kind of made in the similar way, and it's called A History of Magic, Witchcraft and the Occult. And it is kind of written in the way that you have short passages again on things going like through a timeline around witchcraft. And I don't know, it kind of worked in the format as an audiobook, but for me, it wasn't super exciting. I didn't like the reader's voice, and I especially didn't like how badly they pronounced so many things. It was hurting my ears. I was laughing out loud when they were trying to speak Finnish also. It was hilarious. But because in the part they also spoke about the Sami shamans in the book. But if you're interested on a 7-hour journey through a history of witchcraft and you don't mind having those small bits and pieces, it might be worth listening. It has been highly popular, so even though it wasn't my favorites, I prefer the big book that I showed last time on the history of magic, but there's one option there. Then also one cornerstone book, if we're talking about the history of witchcraft, is Ronald Hutton's Triumph of the Moon. I've never seen the physical book, but if I understand correctly, it is huge. And even the audiobook is 3 parts. It's super long, but also the topic is super interesting. But what I read, because when I was considering on buying the physical book and the audiobook, I was reading in Amazon the reviews of other people, and people were complaining that it was hard to read, that the text was small, and because it is scholarly, a bit drier text. So then I decided, okay, I will get an audiobook. But it turned out that the reader's voice is really off-putting. So I really have to struggle with this book, and I really have to try to concentrate so I can take in the information, because the sound of the reader's voice is so distracting. So I haven't finished this book yet, even though I'm super interested about this book, but on this technical matter, it has been keeping me away from really immersing with that book. Then another book, Beesome, Stang and Sword by Christopher Orapello and Tara Love Maguire. And this book, even from the beginning, it's its own system. They are not using the tools like in Wicca. It is very kind of different than the most of the tools and the things around books that are based more on Wiccan practices. So it's kind of its own system. But what I think is, I think it's a good book if you want to read books around witchcraft that are highly practical but are not using the Wiccan terms or the Wiccan ideology, if that's something that you don't like. So then this might be a good book for you. For me, it's kind of maybe even too different to my taste. And I think that I would get more out of this book also if I would have chosen to have a physical copy, because it really is so, you have so many exercises coming and rituals and things that it's really hard to try to listen and to get something out of it when there isn't like a long bit of storytelling and then the exercises at the end or something. So it doesn't work the best in the audiobook format. But I think an interesting read if you want something different. Then we still have 2 books to go. And first one of them is Initiation into Witchcraft by Brian Kay. What this book is all about, it's all about traditional initiatory witchcraft. So we are talking Gardnerian or Alexandrian witchcraft in this book. So if those are the topics that interest you, I would highly recommend this book, because I think I first got it as an audiobook, and I thought that it was so good that I actually ended up getting a physical copy, like with the Aradia. Even though this book is constructed in a very typical way, that first you have the kind of booky part and then you have the grimoire part, as are many witchcraft books. But when we divide, the majority of this book is like the meat, and then there is the grimoire part, which is kind of like 1/3. So the fact that this book has so much things that work on an audiobook, so I think that this is one of the best books to work on the audiobook format that I have listened so far on witchcraft. I think this book is really essential for people who are interested about the traditional English initiatory forms of witchcraft, Alexandrian or Gardnerian, or also other branches that have come out of those earliest Wiccan traditions. So if you are interested on working with the modern witchcraft techniques that were, first presented to the world in the 1950s by Gerald Gardner, and because most of our witchcraft techniques and things that people do are based on that, even though no matter how much people say that it's not Wiccan, but I don't know, for some reason some people have this big pushback towards all things that have the word Wicca in them. And I don't even specifically like the term Wicca so much, but it is actually a label that has been given later on, mostly around Scott Cunningham's time, around many things, and people have kind of different opinions around that. But this book is really helpful for seekers. This talks a lot about the religious side of witchcraft. So if you're interested about that, even though you might not even be wanting to join a coven, if you're interested about the gods and goddesses, this book has long and really good sections about it. And one section that I really liked was the history, kind of the modern history of witchcraft covens and how the lines and the branches have gone. So even if you're not interested on joining a coven, but you would be interested to see how they have formed and how they have evolved, this was highly interesting on that part also. And then there is the grimoire part. But when it comes to Brian Kane's book, I will be talking more about this book later on, because it is one of my absolute favorites, but totally also works as an audiobook. Then let's jump into the last book. And this is a book that is all over the social media nowadays, and for a good reason. And it's Rebel Witch by Kellyanne Maddox. I decided to go with the audiobook because I needed something to listen right now. Kellyanne has herself been reading the book to the audiobook, so I knew that there is a voice that I am used to listening, and a voice that I can listen for hours and hours. So that's why I decided to first go with the audiobook with this one, and because it was the fastest way to get it. Overall, Rebel Witch, I think it is really a good depiction of today's time. It is probably one of the most inclusive books I've read around witchcraft. The whole theme around Rebel Witch is like, you do you, boo, kind of that way. Kellyanne, she talks about these basic concepts that practically all the witchcraft books do. But on the other hand, she's always giving the reader or listener a permission to do whatever they want to. So it's kind of like, if we think about a tarot deck, but you would give it without the names of the cards. So it's like, here is the High Priestess, but you don't have to call it the High Priestess. You can kind of call it whatever you want. I don't know if you get my metaphor, but it's kind of, there is the same structure. Many of the things, the concept that she is talking about already is available in many of, for example, Wiccan books. There are the basic things around casting circles and using different witchy tools, doing puppets, doing this and that. So the basic core is there, kind of like in the tarot deck. You have the system, but this book kind of lets you take an eraser and erase all the titles off, and you can name them whatever you want. But when it comes to me, I think a tomato is a tomato, no matter what you would call it, or things like that. So, but some people might really like to approach a book in that way when they are not hearing the terms that they dislike for some reason. And I think that this might be the biggest thing, that why the Rebel Witch idea would be highly appealing for many. What I really love about the book is that Kellyanne makes us question things. She asks a lot of great questions. What does this mean to you? Write it down, think about it, write it down. So she is activating our brain cells to think what things mean for us. And I think that is a really beautiful thing. And then it's all done in her style. So if you love Kellyanne Maddox's style, you will also love the book. But I think also on the other hand, it might be a bit sweet and kind of cute for some people. I don't know if this book would been read by anybody else on the tape than Kellyanne herself. I think it would be really weird to hear like some British dude saying all of her catchphrases like cupcakes and Pop-Tarts and all these cutesy little words that Kellyanne uses a lot even on her videos, because they are heavily also included in the book. But I think this book is a good snapshot of the time that we are living nowadays. Really, really inclusive and highly positive, and kind of for people who are seeking for validation or permission from an authority to do as they see fit. This book at least gives you the permission to do it your way. But I think definitely worth of reading, and works also quite well as an audiobook. Okay, so it seemed that I was yabbing too long to my camera, and the camera had stopped recording midway in the session, and I just found out in the editing phase. But to summarize this whole episode on the audiobooks of Witchcraft, I had few favorites there. I think Aradia was nice, like the Kellyanne Maddox and the Brian Kane books. Those were my favorites. But overall, I think it is a challenging thing to find audiobooks that really work when we are talking about something so practical as witchcraft. But if you have any comments or questions, let me know down below. And let's see the next episode on this series, the more traditional Wiccan books, next time. So until next time, bye guys!